Hello and welcome to this webinar on Who's in the Pews. My name is Kathy Elliott and I'm a part of the NCLS research team working in marketing, communications and business development, and I have the honour of being your MC for today. We have well over 600 participants registered for our webinar today, so we welcome you and thank you for joining us from wherever you are. We would love to know who you are and where you are from. So please go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat. We are here today in Macquarie Park and would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Watamatical clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture the land we stand on. We also acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands our participants gather on today. We pay our respects to all elders past, present and emerging. Today we will have input from Dr. Ruth Powell, Director of NCLS Research, followed by reflection on each of the main topics by our panel of ministry practitioners. At the end of our presentation, there is the opportunity for you to remain online and join a breakout room with the ministry practitioners to ask questions or share your reflections and thoughts from the session today. Reflecting on each of the key areas, gender, education, age and ethnicity, are our panel of ministry practitioners. Each of our guests have a wealth of experience in each of these areas, and we've invited them to provide practical applications that we hope you'll find useful. For gender, we have Major Sandra McLean. She's the Faith Communities Development Secretary in the Salvation Army. Reflecting on education will be Dr. Cos Crosscombe, who is the Community Engagement Pastor with the Anglican Diocese of Sydney. For age, we have Aaron Fozzard, who is the Youth and Young Adult Team Leader for the Baptist Union of Queensland. And finally, for ethnicity, we have the Reverend Dr. Paul Goh from the Uniting Church South Australia. He is a Korean-Australian Uniting Church minister and currently working with the Synod of South Australia's Mission Resourcing Team. Many of you will be familiar with the different functions in Zoom that we will be using today, but for those less familiar, here are a few tips so you can make the most of today. Chat. Look for the speech bubble icon, click or tap, and then you can type and introduce yourself or ask questions. Breakout rooms. If you would like to stay on at the end of the presentation and join the breakout group with our panellists, watch for the invitation box and just select join. For more than 30 years, NCLS Research has been the source of credible research into church life, health, leadership, and Australian spirituality. Recognising the strengths of working in partnership, NCLS works with more than 20 denominations, many agencies, mission organisations and universities to provide valuable insights and encourage deeper understanding. One of the things that NCLS Research is all about is equipping us to move from what we think and feel and the assumptions that we make towards a better understanding of what actually is. It is by our researchers asking great questions, the questions we want to ask and the questions we didn't know how to ask, or the questions that we were afraid to ask, that we are able to share insights and grow in our understanding. The research shared today is from the questions asked in the latest National Church Life Survey and will give you key insights into Australian churchgoers and who really is in the pews. It is our hope that these insights will help you, your church and others in your ministry and mission. We would like to take this opportunity to thank and acknowledge our sponsor of today's webinar, Baptist Financial Services. For over 40 years, Baptist Financial Services has helped ministries get the funding and support they need to build and expand their ministry operations. They offer a range of savings and term investments to help pool funds to resource Christian ministry. Loans and other assistance are made to churches and Christian organisations to support their work and activities. For more information, please visit bfs.org.au. And now to start our presentation today is Dr. Ruth Powell, Director of NCLS Research. She's also an Associate Professor and Research Fellow at Charles Sturt University. Who's in the pews? Now, I do know that many churches don't actually have pews these days. I even have a couple of old ones in my back deck. Our question is really, who goes to church in Australia? I'll use the latest research to paint a big picture of the current church landscape. And can I add my personal thanks to our panellists who will help us ground these findings. Knowledge is vital, but the so what is critical. Our current estimate is that there are 11,400 local churches across the nation. And even if some have now closed, this is a much more extensive footprint than the 7,200 service stations and 4,320 post offices that exist. How many Australians fill those pews? We define frequent church attenders as someone who goes at least once a month. 1 in 5 Australians, or 21%, reported that they attend religious services at least monthly, and most of those people will be attending Christian church services. Our current best estimate is that around 7% attend church on a weekly basis. So what impact has COVID had on church attendance? Well, we don't fully know yet. We're still collecting current information from all those local churches. But anecdotally, we hear that attendance has declined or that people are attending less regularly. We do have some clues about attendance and the impact of COVID from various sources. While we saw a drop in attendance in 2020, by November 21, Australians reported that they attended religious services at pre-pandemic levels, 21%. We'll be checking it again in November 2022. We heard rumours that COVID had disrupted the rusted-on attenders, particularly in states impacted by long lockdowns. Long-term habits were tested. People spoke of having a break from church life. Others spoke of visiting other churches online, from cathedrals to mega churches overseas, to small gatherings in paddocks in rural Australia. So we tested these ideas of disruption. In the National Church Life Survey, we asked church attenders if, compared to 2019, before COVID, are you more or less involved at this local church? We have a solid, committed core of around 6 in 10 church attenders, with 4 in 10 who are changing their engagement. 2 in 10 say they're more involved, while another 2 in 10 say they're less involved. Another new question we asked in 2021 was, do you attend church services elsewhere? Around 6 in 10 Australian church attenders only attend one church. However, around this core, there are 4 in 10, or 38%, who say they also attend elsewhere. They could pick 2 options. Some 26% said they attended in person and 17% online. Now, this is particularly a Catholic pattern, with more than half Catholics attending Mass elsewhere. But even 26% of Protestants say they do so. 15% of Protestants go in person somewhere else, and 15% say they attend online. What about inflow into churches? When you consider all attenders, 3 in 10 have been at their current church for less than 5 years, which means 7 in 10 are long-term attenders. Now, we define a newcomer as someone who has joined their current church in the past 5 years and did not come from another church. In 2021, 5% of all attenders were newcomers without that church background. This is a drop that we expect that is at least in part a COVID effect. I'm now going to give you a demographic profile of church attenders, looking at their gender, education, age and ethnicity. And after I speak, I'll invite each one of our practitioners to add their own reflections. We'll start with gender. This used to be the simple one. The Australian National Census, run by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, ABS, in 2021, found that 51% of Australians are female and 49% are male. In contrast, there are more women than men in Australian churches, 61% women, 39% male. The ABS are yet to release results on their non-binary category, but in the 2021 NCLS, 0.2% of church attenders chose the category Other. In this presentation, we will focus on female and male differences. So we found there are more women than men in church life. This was no surprise. We have seen this in every Australian National Church Life survey since 1991. Across the globe, in most cultures and religious traditions, women tend to be more spiritual or religious than men. They're more likely to pray, to say faith is important, and to attend worship. And there's a lot of theories as to why. One explanation is that women live longer than men on average, and churches have an older age profile. However, males are underrepresented in every age group in the NCLS, from the 8-year-olds who did our children's survey to the oldest attenders in their 90s. So where do we see differences and similarities between women and men in churches? First, women are less likely to be the senior leader of local churches. Some 22% of local senior leaders were women. And they were most likely to be found in Pentecostal churches, followed by mainstream Protestant churches, Anglican, Uniting, etc. Second, leadership and ministry roles within churches also differ by gender. Women are more likely to be involved in children's ministry, music, small group leadership, pastoral care. They are less likely to do teaching and preaching, or to be on the council or board, or be an elder or deacon. However, when it comes to attitudes and experience of church life, there are more often similarities than differences. For example, there is little to no difference between men and women when asked if they agree their gifts and skills are encouraged, are fully confident that their church can achieve the vision and goals it's set, or who want to be more involved. Major Sandra McLean will now offer her reflections on how gender interacts in church life.
Hi, my name is Sandra McLean, and I help Salvation Army leaders to explore models, platforms, and paradigms of faith community so that people can flourish in a rapidly changing world. My dad, now in his 80s, has been a lapsed church attender for over 50 years. He was a regular attender at church in his youth, even had some leadership positions. But marriage, 4 children, working night shift, migrating to Australia, starting up his own business, did not leave a lot of room in his life for church attendance. And there wasn't a Church of Scotland over here. I often worried about this and thought that as an ordained minister, I should help my dad to reconnect with the church. But my dad only attended the church now for weddings, funerals, and the dedications of infants, except for when he would come to visit me on holidays. And then I think more out of a sense of duty and love for me, he would come along to whichever church I was leading at the time. I put a fair bit of pressure on myself to try and create the best worship experience and preach the best sermon in the hope that I could help my father to reconnect with the church. I'm not sure if it was the quality of my preaching, but after 20 years, I discovered it probably wasn't going to happen. About 15 years ago, my dad came to visit me, and at that time I was not in pastoral ministry, and he said to me, "All right, so where are we going to church today?" And I said, Well, I don't have to go anywhere. What would you like to do today? My dad's an avid walker, and he said, I'd love to go for a walk in the Dandenong Ranges. And so that was how we spent our day. It was a wonderful day with my dad, and I'll always remember it, where he spoke to me about the plants and the birds and the animals, and he expressed to me how he worships God. And I realized that my dad had created a space and a place for worship, even if he never sat in the pews. For 25 years, the NCLS has shown us results that are quite interesting around who is sitting in the pews. Despite the fact that the Australian population is almost an even split between male and female, when it comes to church attendance, it's set around about the 60 to 61% female and around about the 39 to 40% male. Many good theories have been developed about why this might be the case. The socialization of women, where people find power, who's responsible for the moral education of children. You can read some of these theories on the NCLS website. Some people have suggested that men might be less religious, less devout, less spiritual than women. I've conducted some of my own research, and the men I have spoken to have told me church is boring. It's too passive. It's too ethereal. It doesn't connect with my real life and my problems. I'm not into Christian karaoke. People might suspect my motives if I go to church. Really, I do not have time for it. Taking care of my family, my home, my job, my health. There is no time to connect with church. So what if the problem is less about men being unspiritual and more about the models of church that we perpetuate? A member of my team has spent the last year exploring how to build relationships with men by participating in lots of community groups where men already attend. Park run, men's walk on and talk, barbecues, paddleboarding, Rotary, men's sheds. He's been going along and building relationships with men. And what he has discovered is that men are more than willing to talk about faith and spirituality and life. He's built almost 100 connections with men, and he has been surprised by how many spiritual conversations they've had. He's even been asked to perform a number of weddings. Perhaps if the focus is put on creating opportunities for fellowship, for service, for activity and relationships, we may find that maybe men are not inherently less spiritual, and success may not be best measured by who is in the pews. Thanks for listening.
Let's now consider the education profile of all Australians compared to church attenders. More Australians have a university degree than previously. For example, it went from 18% in 2006 to 25% in 2016. The ABS will release 2021 figures in October. The National Church Life Survey reveals that people who attend church are highly educated. In 2021, 44% had university degrees, up from 27% in 2006. Some 19% of attenders have a postgraduate degree or diploma. 25% have bachelor degrees. That makes the 44%. 17% have a diploma and 10% have a trade certificate. 30% have completed primary or secondary school, which is closely linked to the older age profile of attenders. Which groups of churchgoers are most likely to have university degrees? Younger attenders. Around 7 in 10 attenders between 30 to 50 years have a degree. Migrants. 57% of those from non-English speaking countries who took part in our survey have degrees, and that compares to 39% of Australian-born. Attenders in Protestant denominations are more likely to have degrees than Catholic or Pentecostal attenders. and those from the following denominations have at least half with university degrees: Presbyterians, 53%, Anglican, 51%, and Baptist, 51%. When we consider formal education levels, the gap between church and community remains a challenge. Ministry staff also need to respond to changing expectations of teaching and learning situations from younger generations. Cos Crosscombe will provide some reflections around this theme.
Hi, I'm the Reverend Dr. Cos Crosscombe. I work for the Anglican Diocese of Sydney. I have two roles here. One is local ministry in the Mount Druitt area out of a church. And the second is with the diocese looking at our work in marginalised or what are generally poorer communities across the region and how we do those things. I've been asked by NCLS to speak a little bit about what we're seeing in the educational elements of the latest surveys. And just briefly, what we've seen is a gap between those who come to church and their education levels and those of the surrounding communities, where we find that those who go to church generally have a higher level of education or tertiary education. In 2006, about 27% of people who attended churches and filled out the surveys came from higher education backgrounds. That's now grown to 44% for churches. And we know within the Anglican Church, it's actually over 50%. So over 50% of all people 15 years or older have a tertiary education and go to church. Now, there's some great things in that and some positive things and differences than the rest of the world. And so there's some things to celebrate there. Great university ministries going on, perhaps helping people move upwards, creating good support systems for immigrant communities. Those things are all really great. However, there's also challenges, and what we're finding is that a limited number of churches are working in poor communities. Certainly a limited number of effective ministries are taking place. And we find that even those churches in those communities, they tend to be dominated by those with a higher education background, often who might drive into that community. And so there's a disparity there that we want to look at and look at addressing. It'd be nice to share, like, what are some of the thoughts on how we change that? And it's such a complex system and so many dynamics going on. But I think one of the big issues is how we train people. That we use a higher education training staff for ministers across the city. And this is not restricted just to the Anglican Church, but is prevalent in other churches. Because of that, we tend to find people who are attracted to higher education. And while they're in seminaries, we tend to grade them based upon how well they do in higher education styles. And so we affirm that background, and then we deploy them into communities. Most often, they're going to want to go back into communities similar to where they came from, which tend not to be the lower educated and poorer communities of the city. We also often are teaching what's called a homogenous principle, or a sweet spot ministry might be another way of putting it, where we help people say, well, you're going to reach people most like you. And well, if we're already deploying people who have a higher education level and incline that way, most likely they're going to be reaching out to people who also have a higher education background. And so that will continue that disparity. They're also most likely to put other people in leadership who are like them, because I see that strengths and giftings in the others. So the leadership of the church, not just the minister, but the actual leadership will tend to skew in that direction. And I think what we miss in this is misunderstanding that people in poor communities, people who haven't been to higher education, can be just as phenomenal leaders. In fact, just been studying through the book of James, and in James 2, he says that, hasn't God made those who are coming from poor backgrounds, the poor, to be spiritually rich? They're the ones who are given rich spirituality. And I found that around the world, that the thriving communities in most of the world spiritually are poor communities. So I think we've got to look at our training systems and our deployment systems. I think we've also got to recognize that a lot of churches, not all, but a lot of churches are designed for the middle class. The service time, the way the service is run, the style of preaching, the transactional nature are all there. I think we've seen that as a COVID piece where for some, the online church has replaced in-person church because it's continued that transaction or that intellectual side. I think we've missed that those in poor communities and those with lower education levels tend to be far more relational. And when they go to church, they're looking for longer times. looking for longer times where they can build relationships. They're often coming in with larger relational needs, so needing a stronger network, more familiar in their structures, so they're looking for more of a family atmosphere. I'd say they tend to react more and develop more around preaching that goes to the heart and to the emotion rather than to the head, the intellect. I've heard numerous times from people who come from low education backgrounds who say they go to church and they feel like they're in school and sitting in the back being the dumb kid who doesn't know the answers. In fact, on Sunday, I watched somebody walk out of a church because they'd started a trivia and they said, just makes me feel dumb. So we need to think and understand that perhaps our whole style has been slanted more towards one group. And because of that, others don't feel welcome in our churches. They don't feel like the church engages them where they're at. And that can be a language thing. It can be a cultural and contextual thing. For some of our communities, it's just the fact that we don't have churches in locations where people can access them. If you're using public transportation to get to church on a Sunday morning, it's about the worst time to try and catch public transport. So what might be a 5 or 10 minute drive for one person could be an hour-long journey for another to get to church. So we've got to recognize those factors. There's a whole bunch more. It's very complex. It's certainly a really challenging thing and one that we want to address and want to address with other churches and other denominations well outside ours. Come back to the chat room that's going to happen after this if you want to hear more, or just reach out personally. Thanks so much.
Younger people are missing from Australian churches. The fact that Australian churches are ageing is a well-known story which has been told for decades now. However, this was not always the case. In 1966, a landmark study called Religion in Australia came to the conclusion that a person's age made little difference to whether or not they went to church. The clues were there, but it just missed the imminent upheaval that was about to take place in the age profile of churchgoers. Previously, if a young adult moved away from church involvement, they would come back once they'd reached the stage of life where they had their own children. However, then came the baby boom generation, those born after World War II. Now, each generation has their own character, shaped by the social and cultural factors of their time, but the baby boom cohort was also very large. And so if you imagine recent decades as a python, then the baby boomers are like the mouse swallowed by that python, which bulges out at each point, making a huge impact as it passes through. This generational cohort filled the Sunday schools in the 1950s. Then, in the 60s and 70s, they left church life as young adults. Mostly, they did not come back, and they did not bring their children back. And the consequences of this major disruption continue to impact on today's church. So where are we at now? We're just going to consider those aged 15 years and over. In 1991, 10% of Australians were aged 70 plus. By 2021, 15% were aged over 70 years. In the church, in 1991, 16% of churchgoers were aged 70 plus, and by 2021, 36% of all attenders are aged over 70. Now, there are distinct differences between movements. Catholics and mainstream Protestant attenders have the oldest age profile, and in contrast, in Pentecostal churches, they have the youngest age profile. In some parts of the church, the older profile is having a much greater impact now than 30 years ago when the NCLS started. Of course, many older people are thriving. However, it is not being ageist to acknowledge the increased burden now carried by attenders in their 70s, 80s and 90s who are trying to keep local churches running. Now, I'd like to change our focus to the young adults who are in churches. Aged 15 to 30 years, they fall into the Gen Z or Gen Y or Millennials cohorts. Considering that group, nearly half of all young adults joined their church in the past 5 years. Some move from other churches, but nearly 1 in 10 young adults are newcomers without a church background. That compares to 5% overall. Young people tend to cluster. Like attracts like. While many churches have no young people, where there are churches with clusters of young people, it is worth giving those churches as much support as possible. Young adults in church are most likely of any age group to report that they have experienced much growth in faith, that they are fully confident that their local church can achieve what it's set out to do, and that they would support the development of new initiatives of their church. In terms of leadership development, they are also more likely to say than any other age group that their gifts and skills are encouraged to a great extent by the leadership, and that they have leadership or ministry roles. Further, they tell us they want to be more involved. What an encouraging picture. The young adults who are part of the Australian churches are most likely to be most positive about their experience. So how do we put all this together? First, we know that younger people are missing from many local churches. Second, we've learned that there are young people who love church. In many ways, those who did our survey are the most positive and satisfied. They are empowered, equipped, and enabled to be fully part of their faith communities. Young people are orbiting. In between those who've left and the strong concentrated core that we hear from, I suggest that there's an increasingly large group orbiting. For example, we learned from the Australian Community Survey that 3 in 10 young adult Australians say they attend church at least once a month. They come less regularly, so we don't notice them and don't count them. They are curious, know little about the Christian faith, but are not hostile. Here is Aaron Fozzard to share some of his insights with a particular focus on young adults.
Hi fam, I'm Aaron from Baptist Union of Queensland, and I'm going to focus on age, specifically young adults in church life. As you may already know, there is no silver bullet for this particular age group. Actually, there's no silver bullet for any age group. However, there seems to be 3 things or 3 requirements that all humans require. We require a place where we can find our identity, find purpose, and create or be part of a community where belonging happens. The data shows that this young adult age has been in steady decline for a very long time. And the conversations I have with churches around Queensland can be all summed up in one question: where have they gone? Now, it's likely, actually, I know that this isn't just in Queensland, this is across Australia. Where have they gone? It isn't disputable that church life looks completely different to even 10 years ago. In the last 2 years, due to the pandemic, we have all likely felt this sense of discombobulation and discouragement and disconnection. Yet some things remain the same. We crave to belong to a group, to have a clear idea of who we are and what we stand for. Young adults and teenagers want these too. Now, this age group is also driven by a cause. They want a cause. Now, just look at Greta Thunberg's activism and how she had inspired this age group to action. It is also, according to Jean Twenge in her book iGen, that this group is by far the most unhappy group. She suggests this is due to the overuse of technology for connection. Now, one story she shares supports this with her data as she talks about Grace. Now, Grace is a young lady who is connected well with her friends, great friendships, but when she sees an Insta post of her friends out having a good time without her, she instantly feels as though she is not their friend anymore. She becomes unhappy. Now, technology is good for some connection, but iGen, as Twenge refers to them as, like other humans, require belonging to a physical group of people. The amazing thing is that you the church. You, the church, have been and have the capacity to continue to create places of belonging for our generations. However, we might need to look at how we are helping them feel as though they belong, especially the fringe group. Moving from rigid set of rules of how one requires to act or look in church service and nitpicking on the small things towards embracing them for who God has created them to be. The idea of new wine in old wineskins comes to mind. New wine requires to be placed in new wineskins because if it's placed in old, it is likely going to burst or the wine hemorrhage. Put in a more contemporary way, we require to approach this young adult age group with an open-handedness to how we allow or empower them to be themselves as they too are part of the priesthood of all believers. It is likely, if we do not, we will continue to see this age group hemorrhage from our churches. As a Baptist, I deeply believe in the priesthood of all believers. And this means all who know Jesus as Lord and Savior and proclaim Him as Lord, know Him in their heart, are part of the kingdom and His service. God's people have the capacity by Holy Spirit to create places of belonging. This belonging begets the opportunity to release young adults into finding their identity in Christ-centered community, while being driven by the fuel, the gospel. The gospel still has power. It is our role to help our young people be captured by it like we were. But it may look different. One area that may be helpful is balanced leadership development opportunities, specifically for this age group. This area has been the focus of the Baptist Union of Queensland this year and have already seen nearly 200 new leaders engaging, wrestling, being stretched, and have seen breakthroughs in their lives with Christ. Developing young adult disciples should be paramount in our churches, and our budgets reflect this. They are the next generation of church leaders and require us to find ways to help them become more like Christ in their God-given way. In my breakout room, fam, we'll be chatting this a little bit further as we move towards creating places of belonging where identity is crafted and purpose is found. Thanks for listening.
Australia is a multicultural nation, one of the most multicultural in the world, second only to Luxembourg. It's also a relatively cohesive society compared with other Western nations. Our community surveys show consistent and strong support for multiculturalism. Churches often form a social support network for people newly arrived in Australia, offering friendship, hospitality, material aid and assistance. So we come to churchgoers. While NCLS attender surveys were provided in 9 languages, we believe that non-English speaking language groups and Indigenous churches are underrepresented in the National Church Life Survey. From what we know though, from the 2021 NCLS, people who identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders represented 1.4% of the Australian church population. This estimate is lower than the 3.2% of the Australian community. In 2021, there were more church attenders born overseas, 37%, than in the Australian community, which has 28%. And this figure has risen over time. 1 in 10, 9%, churchgoers were born in another country where English is the main language. And this figure was the same as in 2016. There's an increasing presence in church life of people born in non-English speaking countries, up to 28% in 2021. Catholic attenders are significantly more likely to be born in non-English speaking countries than Protestant attenders. Some 63% of churchgoers were born in Australia, and that includes Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Just under half of churchgoers are second-generation migrants with at least one parent born overseas. And so while there may be many other differences between church attenders, this personal and family story of the migrant experience is something that many people share. How do people of different ethnic and cultural backgrounds cluster in churches? Do we tend to stick with people like us? Yes. Most churches can be described with the shorthand label of monocultural Anglo. And we know that our figures do underrepresent monocultural non-Anglo churches in terms of them taking part. However, compared with other nations, we have a very high proportion of multicultural churches. In 2016, around 23% of Australian churches were multicultural. That is, where no one ethnic group accounts for 80% or more of the membership. That's the definition. And this figure of 23% compares to 14% in the USA. Around half of all Catholic parishes are multicultural churches. That compares to about a quarter of Pentecostal and other Protestant churches. So do the attitudes and experiences vary across different groups? All attenders were similar in what they value, their own spiritual life, and their views of leadership. However, in a case study we did, non-English speaking born attenders were more likely to be younger, more highly educated, more likely to express positive views about worship and future directions, and less likely to be involved in small groups or in church activities. I'm pleased to invite Paul Goh to bring his reflections on the ethnic and cultural diversity of Australian churches.
Thank you for having me at this webinar. My name is Paul Goh, and I live on the land of the Ghana people. Speaking of my story, my wife, daughter, and I immigrated to Australia 12 years ago. I was ministering first with Korean and then with Anglo plus multicultural and Fijian Uniting Church congregations in Melbourne, and now I'm multicultural officer with the Uniting Church Synod of South Australia. As we just heard from Ruth, it is evident that Australian churches are increasingly culturally and linguistically diverse, changing Australian churches' landscape. There is some evidence that migrants and non-English speaking faith communities are a source of renewal in wider Australian Christian communities. This implies that we need to create more spaces in which different and dynamic faith stories from called Christians and faith communities can be shared with wider churches in a spirit of mutual understanding, receptive ecumenism, and reciprocity. As Ruth mentioned, the figures significantly underrepresent monocultural non-Anglo churches. For instance, in South Australia as of 2019, it was estimated there were 1,437 Christian churches and 211 monocultural non-Anglo churches, which was 15% of all Christian churches. Over the last 10 years, the South Australian Uniting Church has welcomed 5 new non-Anglo congregations, being 4 of African background and 1 of Pacific background. It is remarkable that around half of all Catholic parishes are multicultural churches. In the case of the Catholic Archdiocese of Adelaide, it is reported that there are 57 parishes with 123 mass centers and 21 migrant communities. Yet, it appears many migrant communities are having their own language-speaking mass services and activities within their parishes without deeper relationships with Anglo parish members. In the case of the United Church in 2021, we conducted a survey with input from 55 UCA ministers and leaders and 30 wider called leaders in South Australia. What we found was that there are significant gaps between the high level of support for the Uniting Church's vision of being multicultural church and the actual extent of the implementation of the church's statements and resolutions at its local congregational levels. The percentage of churchgoers born in a non-English speaking country was 28% in 2021. But compared to other churches or the general population, the Uniting Church has a small proportion of its people born overseas. The 2021 census indicates only 2.5% of people who identify their religion as Uniting Church were born in non-English speaking countries. Our congregations still lag far behind their neighborhood and other community institutions in reflecting cultural diversity within the life of the church. That's why I'm recommending moving from a multiculturality to an interculturality framework. Multiculturalism values tolerance, but with no obligation to engage. Now we need to be more intentionally intercultural in worship, witness, service, and discipleship, realizing this is a two-way process of reciprocity. We need to move from a come to us paradigm to a paradigm of going where our neighbors are, discerning and joining in with what God is already doing in our neighborhood. Our question must change from how can our congregation reflect the changing demographics of called communities to how can our congregation connect with the neighboring called faith communities so that we can build a relationship and hopefully partnership with them in shared local mission and ministry together. Thank you.
So, who's in the pews? We have learnt that women are still more religious than men. Churchgoers are highly educated, increasingly so. Generations aged under 60 are underrepresented, particularly in some denominations. And yet, young adults are the most positive of any age group. The multicultural mix in Australian churches has increased over time. The demographic gap between church and community remains. But rather than describing people as being either in or out of church life, I suggest we think in terms of three groups. A core group first. I think we have a more highly concentrated centre and a bigger fringe. Those who have engaged church life are all in. They are happy in their churches. Smaller but strong might be the theme for this core. Then there is the fringe. In between the strong, concentrated centre and those who've left, there is this increasingly large group orbiting on the periphery. They come less regularly, like those young adults, so we don't notice them and don't count them. Some are younger newcomers, unfamiliar with Christianity but curious. Some have prior relationships with church people and are not hostile. Some are migrants. So how do we help them find ways to lean in? And then finally we have to name, there are those who are out of church life, those who feel dissatisfied, disconnected, disenfranchised, and who've left and did not do our survey. To be the church for all Australians will require an ongoing, humble and courageous commitment to the great commandment, to love God and to love our neighbour. Thank you, Ruth. If you're interested in other briefings and insights, NCLS Research is also holding additional webinars later this year. We are conducting multiple sessions on how to make the most of your NCLS results. On October 27, we have How Healthy Are Australian Churches? The reality and experience of church life today. To register for these webinars, please visit ncls.org.au. This concludes this part of our webinar today. Thank you for attending, and we hope you've gained valuable insights into the demographics of who's in the pews and the implications on ministry and mission. Please do complete our evaluation survey. The link is in the chat. We will now be moving into breakout sessions with our panellists. There will be 4 different rooms, one for each of the 4 key areas covered today: age, gender, education, and ethnicity. You are free to join any of the 4 rooms. To join a breakout room, please select the Join Breakout Room button.